for yourself as well?
Yes.
Okay, maybe.
Maybe it's working.
Um,
I'm telling you, we should name the show. Is it echoing today? Oh, you know what? We should develop a really strong echo canceller that will cancel echo no matter what the source of it is. We do it in an FPGA.
I don't know
Run
if
a
that's
fast
possible.
autocorrelator. I think so. There'll be artifacts left, but I'll bet it can be done. Can you imagine? So you were talking about being a guitar player, right? And the effects like overdriven and
Distortion.
stuff. Picture that you could make a box that takes the distortion back out of it, and you hear exactly what was being played as if you were listening to just the strings nearby. That'd be cool.
That would be really hard to do, given that distortion is non-linear.
Oh yeah. Oh, I know that. And the artifacts. The second, and you just said it by saying nonlinear, but the secondary order is second in terms, and then just what happens when something does clip and goes sideways on you and up the spurious frequencies. Yeah, I didn't say it'd be easy.
No.
Actually, you know how you would do it? You would teach an AI. You would just give the AI good speech, give it the bad speech, and tell it to make the bad speech good again. Instead of writing it yourself.
We've finally done it, Bill. I should have done that at the beginning of the call. I've got word from Eric Olbach. Thank you, Eric, that we both sound good on both YouTube and Facebook.
Is that Eric from Altium?
No, I don't know.
Okay.
Maybe.
Eric with a CH?
Yes, it must be. Thank you, Eric.
Hi, Eric.
He's one of our top-notch tech support guys. Thank you, Eric.
He helped me the other day. He was on 11 streams, and I was his 12th, I think.
Well, now he's on our stream.
Yeah. I'll
Okay.
get you back, Eric.
So now that we're 45 minutes in and finally got the sounds figured out.
Yeah, I gotta go.
Don't say that.
I'm not wearing a watch. I don't have to go.
No. My plan was always to go as long as we wanted, but probably around about an hour. So given that, we've got some time.
Oh, I was thinking 20 minutes, but okay, an hour. I can do an hour.
Well, this time. Maybe we'll make it 20 or 30 minutes next time. Okay. So, Bill, you were going to show us the C128 motherboard, and I do want you to bring that up and talk about that some more. But you had some exciting news about that recently, right?
And that's why I was just saying it wasn't on my list to show, and I don't see it, so we're going to have to skip over that. And the next show,
so that's
not about echo.
That can be the cliffhanger. That can be the cliffhanger.
There's a new PC board out, and I'm going to show you one. And then here's the thing. I'm going to throw it on the TDR, and I'm going to test something I had to fix 35 years ago. I'm going to use modern equipment to look at what I had to fix way back then.
Okay, so now you wanted to go back, and we originally started talking about, you talked about backslashes and or how do you negate things in Schematic.
Right.
But you had a few questions. You had a few questions about that. So,
well, it's. I was asking actually your personal preference at first, because sometimes when we want to use suffixes and stuff, we use underscores. And remember, I also use FPGA software, and sometimes you can't use a minus sign, a hyphen, because it's a minus sign, and other times you can't use an underscore because it's a special character.
Right. And
so
going back to that,
depends on the CAD yeah.
Yeah, but there was some other stuff you wanted to talk about on the front end of things as an engineer. You know, we've done a lot of marketing and talking in the last 4 or 5 years about PCB because we wanted to close technology gaps and all of that. And that's all good. We fix bugs, add features people have been asking for actual routing, because that's mainly where people have to spend the bulk of their time designing.
Right.
But it's easy to forget Altium Designer is known a lot as a schematic tool as well, and that's a very powerful and easy to use one, but that's my biased opinion. I've been using it for 18 years or something. So but you you came from other tools. You've used Mentor, you've used even Proteus when we first started chatting a few years ago.
I still keep a copy. Yeah.
You've tried, and each tool seems like most engineers have a kit bag full of a few different things for different reasons. And my question is to you, what's the barrier or the holdup? Because I feel like you can have all of those things in one tool, and I guess there's a practical element to if you're a contract designer, so you probably have to use what your customer wants you to for a given job as well. There's a bit of that as well.
Because I'm an old fart. If somebody comes to me, I say, well, I'm going to do my work product in Altium. So and Altium can export and import, so that's not as big a deal. But Proteus, unfortunately, couldn't import and export. So if you started in Proteus, you ended in Proteus. So, but as you were saying earlier, you could give a net list to somebody in pads, and they could lay out in pads and then give it back to you. All those paths exist in there.
Right, but they're all error prone and horrible, and
they are.
Lead to frustration.
But in the old days, we used to hand type net lists in the old days. That's how we actually. And so we had net list day, where one guy would sit there and read it, and the other guy would put a marker right on either the Mylar, or not on the Mylar, but on a blue line of the Mylar, or a schematic or something. So it was all hand checking in the old days.
And so that's just another reason to do it all in one package if you can, because even tools. I think having used the same thing and been an expert at Altium for so many years now, I take some of these things for granted, just the ability to synchronize from schematic and PCB in one tool, one user interface, and use cross-probing, cross-select. But you were talking about one thing, which is no ERCs, which are still a bit of a mystery to a lot of people.
Right.
And so did you want to...
Electrical rule check, yeah.
The electrical rule checking.
Right. So in the old days,
to look at?
It was let's show that in a second, but to set it up for you, there's two sets of things. Electrical rule checks I tend to think of as the schematics. It's like, well, what are you trying to do electrically? And then there's design rule checks, which are like, well, is the pad hanging off the edge of the board? And so in the electrical rule check, I used to be the electrical rule checker as a designer. It was up to me to make sure I didn't leave any floating input pins, that I didn't have two outputs clashing to each other, and that the power pins were hooked up. By the way, I hate hidden power pins. If I have one passion, it's that I don't do hidden power pins, and that we should talk about that on a different one.
Yeah, actually, I agree with you on that one.
Yep.
They're very dangerous.
Because you can make a mistake. If you cannot manually check it, then how do you know the automation's working? That's my point. So for electrical rule checks, what we can do now is there's a whole array of things we can check, and that's under control of the designer. But it'll say, did you really mean for this to be floating input? And then that's where you come in. You show them what a squiggle looks like if you've got that, and that's the official term, right?
Squiggle.
Which, isn't that the same thing for the emissivity? The symbol for emissivity is, don't people call that a squiggle also? The little, it's not an omega. I can't remember. See, I'm a high school dropout, so my Greek is like,
I don't know. Let me switch to the desktop, and so you can see I've got a schematic open now. This one's actually a clean one, so let me try to precipitate an issue.
So I'm still seeing you first off. Yeah, you got to do it to Skype. Okay,
so I'm streaming this as XSplit. So maybe what I need to do is go back to Skype.
Right.
And share my screen. Give me a second here.
Your camera jumped when the door slammed. That was cool.
Oh yeah, my wife just got home from the dentist and she needs to unlock some door and can't find the key. But she has to wait. She'll just have to wait.
I'm waiting to go back to the dentist till after COVID. Yeah. So I'm not seeing you.
I'm trying to share my screen.
I see you on Skype, but I'm not seeing you on my XSplit. So give me a second, and I will So this is a learning experience for all of us.
And I'm on my XSplit. I'm sharing my screen on Skype, but I'm also sending it to XSplit, so that ought to...
And actually, I can see now, and so can the Facebook people, can see both you and your shared screen simultaneously, which is cool.
That is cool.
That is cool.
Let me see.
I'm easily impressed when software works, and that's because I'm cynical.
And on YouTube, we're just looking at my desktop. So let me jump into this real quick. So what you're referring to is the squiggles. Let me bring up a broken or unfinished design here real quick so people know what we're talking about. Let's go to...
So one thing you'll mention is you've turned on interactive design rules probably too, or you do it every time you do a validate.
Not to confuse. Yeah, there's two sides of this. So there's electrical rules checking, and that's entirely on the schematic side. Actually, here's an unfinished design I have, this HexFET power amp.
Oh, so I was around when HexFETs first came out. They were VFETs, where they were trying to not go as lateral with the FET and increase the surface area, because surface area is current and surface area is also heat. And now they make them out of little HexFET-shaped wells, where it's the
like
side
a
of the wells. Yeah, it's oh my God. Sometimes people impress me.
They're really nice.
Just,
yeah, they're really nice.
Yeah.
So what happens here is in older versions of Altium Designer, you'd right-click and say compile. But there was also this background interactive compiler that would look for problems in the way you'd wired up a schematic. And if you did something like, for example, let's call this Q2.
Is this a flip-flop on the front end of this?
These are the squiggles.
Does it have a latch? Yeah, no. But
this is a class. No, this is a power amp, right? So this is a fully differential long tail pair input stage.
Yep.
So this
and I see your splitters and everything. We can actually go through the whole thing. That'd be cool. But go ahead.
Yeah, it's unfinished right now, but I'll do that soon. So it tells you there's a problem. So that, as of Altium Designer 20, that went entirely interactive. And if you really want to run a full batch of tests and get a report, you can right-click here and say validate. But this is the squiggles you're referring to.
Right.
But sometimes you get squiggles. Sometimes you get not Q1.
Yeah, well, that's a squiggle because it didn't have a...
Right, and you fix the problem. So I had duplicated designators, and now I don't.
Right.
Okay, so if I go into another more complex full-on design here, like this one, and see, we have all these IOs on, this is, I guess, a Max 5 CPLD. And if I do something like move that, see, I'm looking at a net label here, and this identifies the wire attached to this pin. And let's say and this is one of my pet peeves, let's say you build a component in the library and you use a grid of 1 instead of 10. Or in other words, if you set your grid to the default minimum, which is 10 mils, you can place objects 10 mils off, right? And so you might be placing schematics and wiring things up, and you might end up with something like this, where let's say the Y height of this object is actually 43 instead of 4300 on grid, and I like to stick to a grid of 100 mils and basically not change it unless I'm moving text. And by text, I mean dumb text, not net labels.
Yeah, press and hold shift.
Because if I zoom out, that looks pretty good when I print this, but the net assigned to this wire is now net U1_34. It's not any longer named host_dout. And people do this kind of thing. The software should be architected in such a way that it discourages at the very least. And out of the box, the default grid for schematic is 100 mil. And so that won't, if you stick with your defaults, that won't happen. But inevitably, somewhere along the line, you'll be wanting to make something look nice to print it out or to fit more on a smaller page, or for whatever reason, maybe you'll just you're in the process of moving around labels for things. And you're like, that seems to be snapping to too coarse of a grid. So you hit G and change grid a few times. So I hit G 3 times. Now I can move this text, which is a designator object, and it doesn't matter where it is. It doesn't have to electrically connect to anything. It's a designator, right? So I can move it on a very fine grid and no problem. And then without thinking, I leave it on that grid, and next thing you know, I'm moving resistors around.
Right.
And they're on that very fine grid, and then sometime later I realize, oh, I don't want to be on a grid of 10 mil, I want to go back to 100. And so you're editing someplace else, and you completely forget what you've done down here. But
been there, done it.
But,
or you
but
go into
now,
a component editor.
But now I can't click on that resistor to move it back because that resistor's not on the grid that my mouse is currently on. Right? So the only way to get it back is to undo that change, and that's a pain because maybe I've made other edits since, and I don't want to lose those edits. So
what about the
just
place
be very
on grid
careful.
command?
You can
I just saw that the other day.
You can do that. That is I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's a very useful tool for fixing these sorts of issues that people paint themselves into corners all the time.
Right.
And this is a very useful thing to do. So you can go, I think it's, where is it?
Is it edit, move, that kind of thing?
You can see I don't use it very often. It's actually on the active bar, and you have to have selections to do it. So let's select these resistors, and then the align active bar pops up, and there's a generic
align to grid. That's it.
A generic.
Yep.
But you got to be careful. That will do a move. So if you have wires and you do an align to grid, you've got to be super careful because it may break.
It's like anything.
Usually will
it's
break.
Tool. Yep.
It will usually break connections, and you may not, again, a wire may remain off grid by 1 point, but all the other objects snap onto the grid because of the selection you've done.
Right.
Because maybe everything, all these wires were off grid against those pins, and you just do a selection like this and you align to grid. Well, now all the net labels are aligned to grid, but not the wires, and they may be off by just 1 mil. And if they're off by 1 mil, it'll look right, but it won't connect. So you got to be careful, and that's why we have the squiggles.
The RCs.
The squiggles.
Yes.
So if I I don't know, let's do this again. Let's move that by
real quick.
a few points.
Let me stop you for a second though, because you're also making my point. See how it says host declock? Go ahead, zoom back in. Zoom back in like you were.
Yeah.
See how you can't see the underscores, and so you
Yeah.
assume there's an underscore, and that's why I don't like underscores. I use hyphens, but some CAD systems go, no, a hyphen is a minus sign.
Right.
So, but that I detest underscores, me personally. Now, if you use FPGA editor, I think you have to use underscores. I think you get into trouble if you use hyphens. But go ahead. That you just hit on a pet peeve of mine.
Yeah. So here's another thing. The electrical rules that generate the squiggles. See, I just went and did a validate, and I don't see no squiggle, and I should be. So that's a problem. And so it makes me want to go and check the settings. If I right-click on the project and go in here.
Oh, validate. Did you validate? I'm sorry, I missed that. I was playing with my...
I did a right-click validate. Now, where is that window? Let me do Windows M. That's not the
Yeah,
right.
the last thing I want to do is actually use Altium in front of somebody, because if you saw me using Altium, Ben, you'd be going, oh, no, faster. No, that's the wrong menu. Wrong menu. No, go faster, because I'm old.
Yeah.
I'm just not that CAD speedy anymore.
What's the? I've forgotten a
I
shortcut.
have a hard time with a phone. All those buttons on the phone with numbers. I mean, they can throw me sometimes,
Yeah. Bill, remind me the Windows shortcut to get a. It's Alt Shift Space
For what?
to get a lost dialogue that's off monitor back on.
Oh, no, I didn't know you could find a lost dialogue. I end up like moving stuff. And I have had a dialogue where it just dings, and it's up to you to find the dialogue. I mouse over Altium sometimes, and that'll show you if you have two windows, like you just did.
Yeah, let's go.
But you don't
Alt.
have to see it work for people to understand what you're saying.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure we knew where to go to get to the setting.
So, and I thought
But,
I did see a setting that said enable interactive ERCs. I thought I still saw that, but I have mine turned on, so I didn't know that if it's turn offable these days.
Yeah, it's fully configurable, and some of them you can turn off. And there's one that says floating net labels. So if I run a validate on this, it ought to flag this as an error. That's what I was trying to show, but anyway. Yeah, we probably don't have time to go too much further, but
Yep.
so that's just a little tip, and we'll do more of these in future streams now that we've figured out how to get it working. I'm just switching back to the Skype view here with both of us.
And you know what might be handy is like the demo you just did. If you actually produced a small 2-minute thing that showed it like calmly and narrated by you, you could show it live and then put a link to it so people later could watch just that tip.
We can. We actually have a lot of these tips already done. The difficulty is corralling the videos. But what we're doing is we're putting all of this kind of technical how-to stuff in the Altium Academy channel, which is why I wanted to stream to the Altium Academy channel on YouTube today.
Right.
And yeah.
So, and you were right, by the way, about Google. I was going, hey, I now use Google to look into the manual of Altium, for example, because it's putting version 20 up at the top. And I'm going, hey, that's some great SEO, which it is because it's compatible with Google. But then I remembered that something I've already learned, which is no, it's doing that because of my history. And if I were to go incognito, I wouldn't get as good a result. So you're right. That was Google Googling me, while I was using it. And that's not a good phrase for Google. I mean, Google in the way they kind of hit you in the back a little bit, So, yeah, so I'd love to do like a tip every time, and maybe we'll do those up front so people don't have to watch 20 minutes to get like a tip a show or something.
Yeah, we'll do that. We'll do tips early on. We'll do tidbits. Anything interesting you're working on that's
I got things.
That's public.
Like these things.
That's cool.
We should do, and this is the thing, these aren't for blowing bubbles. That would be perfect for blowing bubbles. These are near-field probes, and you can make one yourself these days, and that's actually something they're so cheap now, I stopped working on a project for it. But we should show this because at a future show, because you hook this to the right equipment, and it tells you how well you did do the PCB layout or emissions problems or other things. So that's one project I had. My other project was an open source radar, and I want to get back on that. Hopefully this gives me the incentive to do that. I was just working on the audio filter today that turns the beat frequency between continuous wave radar back into audio, and you can actually process it with your laptop as if it was audio. So that's like and it's RF though. I get to play with like 2 and 6 gigs, so that'll be cool. Like some stuff to talk about. Yeah.
That's cool. So I've one final closing question for you, Bill.
Okay.
And maybe it's also a topic for another live stream. How would you recommend people go about collecting or obtaining test equipment? Because it's one of the things I've struggled with. First of all, it's hard enough having an actual place to put it. If you're an engineer at a company and the company has its own engineering lab and you work in the lab and you've got it all there, well, fine. But for a lot of us here, we want to build, especially right now with the way things are, we need things at home. We want to build an area at home where we can design things and test things. And, when I went to college, the first thing they said was go get yourself a good multimeter, invest in it, spend a couple of $100, make sure it's a good quality one, because it will be with you your whole life. And they were right. I still have my first DMM, and I've collected some other good old ones even since then. So one tip I would have is, obviously, so here's and this one's actually been calibrated, not recently, but there are places that sell companies that are unfortunately maybe closing out, or they're upgrading all their equipment, and they'll sell everything off real cheap at auction. So that's one way, of course, but it's still hard to get things like VNAs.
You can't get a VNA worth a hang off eBay, for example. Yeah. So you're right about meters.
What would be your advice?
There's my first meter. Yeah. So let me circle back to that, because you that was a loaded way to start when you say, get yourself a good meter. This is my Simpson, 260 from when I was 18. The only thing is I lost the battery box on the back. This still works, and it's intuitive. You can see if something's pulsing around. But then flukes. I've had this one since I was, 8 years after this one, and I still have them. So absolutely, you get yourself a good meter like that. I started when that scope over there, just a Tektronix 2465, was worth like 3 times my salary. And as a home user, not a home user, as an engineer, I had to work at a place that had a hardware lab for me to do my job. I could not do any of it hardly at home except maybe solder. So I've been collecting what you see behind me over 10, 15 years, and almost all mine's eBay. So now I'm not talking about my modern equipment. I have a real good relationship with Tektronix, so that's where I got my VNA. I've got a spectrum analyzer, an RSA, and I've got the 3000 MDO scope. And honestly, a couple of those are worth all the rest of my equipment combined, just one of those. So, but eBay is the thing, and it's really about looking at what you're trying to accomplish, and then you got to apply it to know what you're looking for. And that's the hardest part. That's the hardest part. And not all of mine have been successful. I bought an old spectrum analyzer, and it took me 6 months to figure out that it had always had a blown input. That's why it never made sense what it was showing me. So that's the other thing, is you may be be prepared to throw away what you buy, because you might have bought a piece of junk, and then go try it again, is my advice.
And what about what would be your advice to anyone tempted to build their own? Because sometimes that's almost like an engineering rite of passage. To really be able to use test equipment is to know how it works, and there's no better way.
Hackaday. If you're interested in that, there's people like Ted Yappo on Hackaday, and he is building his own test equipment. My problem with that is, how are you going to test your test equipment while you're building it if you don't have test equipment? So I'm not big on, because I am a professional engineer at my core, my test equipment really is that vision into my circuit that I have. So I kind of don't dink. I use the right scope probes, for example. I won't go get a clone scope probe. It just wasn't worth it to me. So, but there is some amazing, Rigel, how did they say it? That whole series of scopes?
I have no idea how that's meant to be pronounced. I call it Rigol, but that's my Aussie way of saying it.
Yeah, but they really lowered that. When I saw the actual editors at Hackaday start using those, then I'm like, oh wow, they overcame a cost barrier. If Mike Skizzy can, use one at home while he's editing the Hackaday columns and stuff. That was really cool.
Even today, saw on the Twitter feeds someone up in LA selling off their DS1102E, which is the the 2-channel 100 megahertz Regal scope that really took the world by storm. Second,
Right,
he's upgraded, and so he's selling off that one for $40 if you can go pick it up or pay for shipping. And I'm thinking that's just so cheap. Like,
oh, and some of this stuff is so heavy. I had to reinforce that whole shelf area there. You get an old HP signal generator, and it costs you $200 to ship it if the guy's, not a professional shipper. By the way, here's my first multimeter. From when I was, this is actually one I bought on eBay, but I mean, this is the kind I had first. This is a Nixie tube Heath kit. I built it, right?
Awesome.
And I had something wrong in mind, so the first time I grabbed the probes to do like resistance, I caught the 170 volts from the Nixie tube across my hands. And so I hated it every day after that. After I built it, I didn't trust it. It's like, well, is it going to inject 170 volts into my circuit and break it? So I turned it into a clock or something. I just had a ramping voltage or something, But yeah, but I have one of these just because I love the look of Nixie tubes, right?
Yeah, who doesn't?
Who doesn't? That's right.
Who doesn't?
Oh,
they look awesome. Yeah. That's incredible.
Yeah.
I hate to think those things must be worth a mint by now if you can find them.
Russia still has. I don't know if they're actively making them, but they certainly have stock.
that Heathkit meter. If you could find one like that in good working condition, it would be worth a fortune.
Oh, well, that actually works.
Yeah. I might know someone who wants to buy it off you.
Well, I got it off eBay for like $60. So
that's so cheap.
You just have to watch for what you want. So in closing to your question, part of the answer is know what you're looking for, and I set watch filters, and the first time something comes up, don't get married to it. It might be a broken one. It might be just keep looking. And so I waited for that one to come up, and then I snagged it right away when it did. And I always do buy it now. I don't do that biddy. If I want something, I usually buy it now unless they're being obnoxious with the price.
Yeah. Yeah, so, that's how it goes.
All right. Well, this was interesting. It was long. I appreciate everybody for hanging around.
Yep.
Let's see. Yeah, Rigel, somebody's talking about that, so they're still listening, at least over in Facebook. So, let's talk about other stuff in the future. We should tease some things here. We talked about Commodore a little bit. We'll do that. I know ways to break, as you know, I can break Altium. I've shown you negative trace widths and things like that, right?
Yeah.
I showed the auto symbol creator created something off grid. I actually figured out a little bit what's going on. I'll talk to you offline. But yeah, my whole thing is let's also talk retro, and I think you're up for that. And that's what we've been doing by waving this kind of junk around.
Yep.
So, and I'll also tell somebody, if you're stuck on a problem, maybe this is a forum where you can kind of ask that question. Between the two of us, we in theory know electronics, and there's sometimes just being around somebody else, they can go, oh yeah, I did that. Yep. You need to do this to that resistor or something like that, to that circuit, I should say.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's where we want it to go. So now that we've ironed out the bugs of sound and done our first run, the next one ought to be very smooth and have none of those troubles, so we can use the live chat to actually answer questions that come in from outside too, and that would be awesome.
Right. So, all right. Well, I want to thank everybody on the Facebook side for watching, and the YouTube got ironed out, right?
Yep.
You got a good stream going
in the end, and thank you everyone.
Do a save your setup for XSplit.
Yep. I'm going to do that right now.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Thanks, Bill. See you next time.
Take care, man.
Bye.
And down go the stream.